We need to talk. It's been a rough ride, from a culture bent on burning itself down to attacks from within. But by the grace of God, we've been given a moment, a chance to make lasting changes. We can rebuild what's been torn down, but we have to build with what will last, the gospel of the kingdom. This April, let's sit down. Let's talk about what matters. And together, we'll build something that lasts. ReformCon 2025. Tickets are limited. Lord willing, we'll see you in Tucson.
Hey everybody, welcome to Ezra Interviews. I'm Dr. Michael Thiessen, and today I get to speak with a good friend, Jonathan Wellum. And Jonathan is a financial advisor at Rocklinc Investment Partners. Rocklinc has been a supporter of this podcast since the beginning, and we're just so thankful for all that they do over there at Rocklinc. So Jonathan, it's great to have you on the show. And let me just set things up really quick for us. We're going to shoot a short video, but this is a follow-up to a conversation that Nate and I had on the podcast for Cultural Reformation. And that is, what is a biblical view of taxes and tariffs? We were celebrating some cultural victories, and in the midst of that, you get into the Canadian American conversation that's going on about these Trump tariffs. So that's the setting of the call. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, good to be with you. I probably should have caught that show, but I'll make some comments anyway, and hopefully they fit with what you and Nate were talking about. But I have great respect for both of you guys. So.
Well, it's okay if you correct me, and it's okay if you correct Nate, especially if you correct Nate. But this is kind of this is an ongoing conversation that many people are wrestling with, and so let me throw out what I said and what Nate said and some of the scriptures that we were reflecting on, and then I want you to interact with it. So, of course, in the Old Testament, we have the Old Testament tithe being about 10%, with a voluntary, compassionate offerings, voluntary offerings out of contriteness of the heart to the Lord. And so you look at the idea of taking people voluntarily giving money to the operations of the worship of the Lord and taking care of the needs of people, and we get to kind of that 10% area. Then we come to when the people are asking for a king, and we have the warning of God saying, look, if you bring on a king, if you bring on an executive branch, if you bring on a leader outside of just the judges and the prophets, but someone who you want to be a visible sign of strength, okay, well then that king is going to exact further let's say burdens away from you, going to tax you even further. And then Nate also brought up a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 1, where between two nations, the Israelites are entering through Moab. They're entering through the land that God had given to the Edomites. So they're going through that area. And the Lord warns them, pay for what you use and do not provoke them to war. And so our conversation was around the idea, we didn't get into this, but as an economist, I'm sure you want to talk about this, but the danger of price fixing, arbitrary price fixing. But then this idea of tariffs comes into play here. And how should we Christians be thinking about taxes and then this international tariff game? That's kind of the context. So I was saying, I'm currently comfortable with that on the American side because the tariffs are a negotiation tactic. and basically in that conversation in Deuteronomy where it's don't provoke them to war and pay for what you have, nations have to talk about having an agreeable terms of free trade and not abusing one another, and tariffs are a way of negotiating. So Jonathan, that's kind of the backdrop. Nate was fairly against all forms of tariffs, and I thought let's go talk to a Christian financial advisor and economist.
Yeah, no, those are big issues. I think what you have to do is step back for a moment and say, what is the purpose of government in the first place? So exactly how big should your budget be to support the necessary functions of government? And I think that's really important for us to start to think about as Christians. What should the government actually be doing and what should they not be doing? Because as you know, we've had this creep of government, and it's a ratchet effect. It only goes one way, and they just get bigger and bigger. And we've got them doing everything from full health care to education to all sorts of social welfare programs and so forth. So I think the problem is that the government has expanded to such a large degree that then we get into this whole issue of taxation and where are we going to get the money to pay for all of this. And of course, it's very difficult to extract that out of people. So then you get into printing money, you get into different monetary policies, the central bank gets involved and so forth. So it's a big issue. I think so. I think starting point in many regards, which I'm just going to mention, and I'll get into your tariffs and taxation issue, is how big should the government be? How much of GDP, the total production of goods and services, should the government actually control? Currently in Canada, it's about 46% of the economy. It's massive. In the United States, it would be in the low 40s. In a country like France, it would be like 60%. So governments have become massive bureaucratic machines. And this is a big, big problem because ultimately there isn't enough wealth being created by the producers to be able to redistribute the way the government wants to do it. And so this is why we get into all this tension with taxes. So I think taxes, first of all, should be obviously paid or the level of taxation to pay for the essential services, like you're protecting your borders, your military, a certain degree of a legal system, and so forth. The tariffs, I don't have a problem with tariffs if they're used for the right.
Yeah. Jonathan, just before you move into the tariffs, I want to stay on taxes because I think they both overlap, and I want to develop a thought on. I don't want you to rush through taxes. So, when you say the government, like in France, are you saying that the government would consume 60% of the GDP, or would you say the government would consume and control then 60% of the GDP? Is that? Yeah.
Consume and control, so that if you looked at all of the people that are in government and all of the things that they're doing, the healthcare system, education, military, on and on, social welfare system, it would consume about 60% of the GDP. If you were to add up all of the goods and services that were being produced, 60% would be by the government. In Canada, as they say, it's around 46%. In the US, it's in the low 40s because it's a big number because they have a large military spend, which spikes it up quite a bit. And so you're seeing, for perspective, if you go back to 1960, in most countries, with the exception of the US, where it was a little bit higher, again, because of military spending, in Canada, it was 20%, 20%. And so this is a problem because the government, people working in the public sector, there's too many, and they're inefficient, ineffective, as we're finding out, as we see DOGE, the investigation and auditing of the government just shows the tremendous corruption that's going on with government. And this is one of the reasons.
Can you imagine what they'd find in Canada?
Oh, yeah. And so when you go back to Israel, you're talking about Israel. I mean, people could see where the money is being spent. It was a small country. The power was very local. As power becomes more federalized and it gets out of your municipalities and even out of your states and provinces, it goes back into Washington or Ottawa. It becomes more and more corrupt and more unaccountable. And so people, different agendas take over, and it's not about taking care of your own people. It's about lining your pocket. And so what you see is tremendous kickbacks. You see money laundering. You see paying people off, excessive amounts of money going into different projects, and only maybe 50 cents on the dollar actually going into the project. The rest of the money going into people's pockets. The whole situation, again, overseas. We won't go into too many areas there, but basically, so the taxation has to be, I think, audited, controlled, justified. It needs to be looked at on a continual basis. Why are we spending this money? What are we getting for it? Where's the efficiency? We need to really be doing consistent audits on our government. And then people wouldn't, I think, have a problem paying taxes if they knew it was being well spent. But the problem is the more you give money to the government, the worse it becomes. We've seen this in education. I mean, this is why Trump wants to get rid of the National Education Association, why we would want to get rid of our provincial educational budgets and so forth, is because the more the government gets involved and the more it's centralized, the worse the education becomes. It's not an issue of money, it's an issue of bureaucracy and corruption. And so this is why I think we're seeing this frustration with taxation, because there's never enough money to fund the beast. It's always hungry, it always wants more, and it wants more power, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And if there was a fixed amount that they could take, and they could add to balanced budgets, then of course they wouldn't be able to get away with this. And so this is the problem with taxation. And then in concert with central banks, they've been able to get the central banks to print money when they don't have the money that to pay for their bills, and they don't want to take it directly out of taxation because they know the people will rebel. Then they print the money and they create inflation. And that's what we've also seen the last couple of years. So these are big issues, and it's really a system that's very corrupt, very immoral, and beyond, spending money that it shouldn't be spent. And people again, it won't end until people just say enough is enough.
So you and I have talked about this before. I want to get into biblical forms of taxation, or like some Christian thinking about it. Of course, we can't always just go back to the Bible and say, this is for this. But before I talk to you about forms of taxation, because I think that's just another thing that is so commonly accepted. It's commonly accepted that property tax is perfectly fine. It's commonly accepted that income tax is perfectly fine, when in reality, those two things are taxing the individual in a way that makes their freedom, like it's not actually my property. If you can take it away because I didn't pay your taxes, then it's not really my property. And if you can throw me in jail for taxing for me not paying my income tax, then at least in some form I'm subservient to you, the government. So I want to talk about forms of taxation where you would maybe help Christians rethink about some of those things. But before we get there, just explain that idea of inflation. So a sneaky way for them to get more money out of individuals is to create an inflation issue. Mm-hmm. Explain that a little bit, Jonathan.
Yeah, so what happens is that they expand the money supply. So out of thin air, the central bank can distribute money, provide money. So in other words, the government says, we're going to spend money on this program and that program. We're going to send out checks. We've seen governments send out checks over the last number of years. And of course, those checks, where's that money coming from? It's not coming from a tax base. It's actually coming from the central bank, who just printed money, and then it sends it out into the economy. The problem with that is if you increase the money supply, there's more money chasing the same amount of goods and products and services. You haven't increased your production. You haven't increased the amount of goods and services that are in your economy. If you just put more money there, you're just going to bid the prices up. And so what we've had over the last little while, we think we're cheating the system by not taxing people more, because you don't want to, again, to offend them. You want to get elected. And so what you do is you just print money, put it out there, but your economy hasn't expanded. So if you're giving people more money, they'll just spend it and they'll bid the price of things up. This was particularly acute in COVID, when you actually made it even worse because you shut down some production. You actually locked down some businesses. You created supply chain problems. And so you had less and less goods out there, and yet you just filled people's pockets, and you kept their wages pretty similar by just printing money and sending it out through the government. Worst thing you could possibly do. It created this unusual level of inflation. And once you have inflation, prices going up, people's wages, then they try to fight to go up. The unions want to get their wages up. You get a bit of a cycle going on. It becomes a vicious cycle, and it's hard to stop. People, it doesn't just stop on a dime. It's going to take a while, and you have to fight it back down. That's why people are seeing inflation at levels that are quite surprising, and they've seen their standard of living drop quite a bit over the last little while. Why is that? Because the government sector got bigger. They printed money, and and this again, if you want prices to go down, you want wealth to be created, you have to produce, you have to make more, you have to put more into the economy, you have to make long-term capital investments. That's the only way you're going to create wealth, not by printing money.
And it's interesting as you connected that dot for our listeners, and the government got to at least pretend to pay their bills back, because the more money that's spent because of higher prices, they're getting their money back. They're like, people are spending more on less and being taxed on that. So therefore, it's a form of taxation. They're still getting their money back, even though they've created the inflated prices.
Yes, and so the prices go up. You aren't making any more money, so you're giving up more money for the goods. So your standard of living drops. And the other thing that happens is maybe the value of your house goes up. You bid the price of things up, so your house goes up, and you think you're wealthier. But basically, all that's doing is just going up with inflation. It hasn't created any real wealth for you. And what's worse about it is maybe stocks go up. I'm in the stock market, and you think, oh, I'm doing really well. My stocks are going up, but they're being pushed a little bit by the inflation also. And then the government turns around and taxes your gains. They're taxing inflation. It really wasn't wealth that was created. This is the thing people got to get their mind around. Just because your house doubled, most of that's just keeping up purchasing power. It really hasn't created any new net wealth and any advantage for you. It's just kept you in the game potentially, and in some cases you might even have lost money versus the inflation rate. So this is this creep of taxation that they continually tax your income and capital gains and things like that. But really, you haven't created any wealth. That's just inflation that the government has created, and that's why everyone's going like, I'm not getting ahead at all. Like, I'm not this. I'm on a treadmill here, and they're just cranking the speed of the treadmill up, basically.
Okay, so now talk about as I know you advise Christians, and I'm sure that you often just shake your head about all of the ideas that we just so naturally accept. Why don't we spend 3 or 4 minutes talking about forms of taxation? Like, one of the most healthy things that I'm excited about is the conversation that's on the ground here in Kentucky about getting rid of the income tax. You have Donald Trump talking about getting rid of the IRS and the income tax. Property taxes is another thing that is being discussed now as a problem. Talk about forms of taxation that might be biblical or not biblical. Like, what should we be putting our foot down and saying, no, obviously that is a grab. You know what I mean? Like, can we identify that just on the form of the taxation?
I think a good question. One question you'd want to ask as a Christian is why are people actually engaging in that taxation? So if you think of capital gains taxes, for example, why would you tax capital that has actually gone up in value because people have put it in the economy, risked it in the economy, built a business, hired people, created wealth, and then turn around and tax it? And the reason they want to do that, in fact, they want to tax it almost like income, or not even at the lower rates. I think it's envy and greed. So I think one of the questions you have to ask you is, why are this taxation being driven in this direction? In many cases, it's greed and it's envy to your neighbor. And I think, again, it gets back to the biblical issues. We have to be very careful that we're not envious and greedy of other people. So therefore, we just sick taxes on them because they're successful. You don't tax just because people are successful. That's ridiculous. You should be taxing a user tax for different things in order to pay for things. So I could see a sales tax, some tariffs to protect your own industry, your own internal industries in your country, and there's various user taxes if you're using things. But I think this idea of progressive income tax is driven ultimately by envy. The issue of capital gains taxes, I think, is really immoral, that you turn around and you actually tax the most important capital in the system, and that's the money that's going into businesses and investments. Inheritance taxes. Again, you think of inheritance taxes. What's the problem there? You think, well, the whole assumption there is very anti-Christian. It says that these people really don't deserve that money. Of course, we believe in the providence of God. People have different gifts and abilities. And our responsibility is to take care of our family and the next generation, not to make them dependent on the government and strip their money through high inheritance taxes or take away their farms and their small businesses. And so I think there is a lot of biblical theology and teaching that would keep us away from certain taxes. And I think progressive income taxes, capital gains taxes, inheritance taxes, and probably elements of property tax also, you'd want to be very careful. I don't think there's biblical warrant for most of those. And those are largely driven by equalization, the government wanting to make people more equal. They don't like the fact that, there's not the equality of outcome. And that's not for us to determine. That's for God. And I think in the past, when you had the system was operating before all of the socialism that we've had more recently, again, you had larger charitable sector. People gave more money and went into foundations. This is the way things should be operating in order to help people's social welfare, not the government. The government gets involved, as we know, and they put the thumb on you and they destroy families. They destroy our inner cities. They destroy people that are brought in poverty. And so there's a few ideas there just to quickly get out and for a conversation.
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago, there was like a lightning bolt moment for me when one of the Liberals, I wasn't sure whether it was a federal Liberal or an Ontario Liberal, was caught on hot tape saying, look, if we give them $500, what are they going to do with it? They're just going to go blow $500, as if government spending other people's money is going to be more fiscally responsible than an individual who's gone and worked on it, and more deserving to go and spend it as they see fit. Like, it was such an elitist, greedy, elitist is probably the main word there. Just this idea, this French idea that, that we're more logical, we're more understanding about how we'll spend the money, when in reality, we all know it's easier to spend other people's money than our own. Like, if you're going to expense a trip to somebody else, your expenses are far different than what you would spend if you had to pay it on your own. It's just human nature. This isn't costing me. Great. Let's live a lavish life. And in a way, it like you just said, it is greed, and in a way, it's robbery. If I'm knowingly inflating my costs 50% just because I know I'm not quite paying this bill, then that's exactly what we see in this corruption climate that we're in.
If you want to unleash wealth creation and production, you shrink government and you leave the money in the people's hands. We collectively, the people, make far better decisions in terms of capital allocation than any government could possibly make. And that's, again, you look at history, you look at countries, nations, the ones that are most prosperous, the ones that create the wealth over time and so forth, are free markets. They're free enterprise economies. And there's no exceptions. There's no exceptions. There's no country in history that has large, intrusive governments and taxation policies that will create wealth over time. And they will eventually stifle it and create extremes in wealth also. They'll destroy the middle class and the entrepreneurial class, and people will eventually end in squalor. I mean, that's just the way it always works. We know that because of sin. We know that sin has to be kept in check. You cannot let power get too large. It will get corrupted every time. And that would be the same, Michael, if it was you and I, and we had all the power in the world, and give us 10, 15, 20 years, and we would probably be in big trouble too. I mean, you just have to know your own heart. And Christians, the breaking up of power, letting a competitive market situation thrive. If you don't produce a product that's pretty good, people want to buy, you're out of business. A next person will come along and take that business. And so there's nothing like a free market. There's nothing like a market that allows people to make their own decisions and their own mistakes. Mistakes are fine. That's the way we learn, but we learn quickly. One of the problems with government is that it allows it allows decisions to go on for long periods of time that are substandard. And we see this, particularly we've seen this in the green agenda, where there's just bad decisions and more money going after, good money going after bad money. And government never knows when to stop making a bad decision. There's no accountability to them. If it's in the free market, you run out of money, and you got to go to another business. Another business will take over. And this is a huge issue that we're seeing with these large bureaucratic governments.
I did have an excellent time here at Worldview Academy. I'm just so thankful that God actually brought me here.
I love beach volleyball, and I love the lake, and I love the competitions. I love camp, team stuff. I love that.
The things that they're teaching here are foundational.
We live in such a biblically illiterate time where teenagers don't get the foundation.
I need to have these foundational biblical truths in order to stand on something. If I don't have anything to stand on, I'm going to get washed away by culture and the secularism of the world.
Definitely a lot of good doctrines taught, a lot of strong theology, raising up another generation to know how to defend God's word and love his word.
And I think that we've fallen away from that and the truth of the gospel, and we've got to learn these things, and I'm glad the Ezra Institute Worldview Academy has been doing that.
The Bible is the Word of God. The Bible is the Word of God, and the Bible is the Word of God. I love that.
All of the talks and the speakers and the mentors and the staff are so kind. You learn so much. It feels like you're thrown into the deep end with the amount of amazing information you're given.
Not sugarcoating any of these social issues, and then giving a very biblical, faith-based reason as to why we need to stand against and stand for certain issues.
Ezra has definitely equipped me to go out into the world, to talk to everybody about Christ and his goodness.
And it'll help grow your faith and grow your knowledge especially.
I'm so grateful that this academy has been doing that.
I love that point. That's such an important point that the incentivizing of the individual is far different than the way that government employees are incentivized. They want, more pension, more money. And where do we look for it? Oh, we can't afford it. We look for it again. We rob it from the people. We take it from the people. Okay. Jonathan, typically, this, you've been on with me lots of times. Typically we're an hour. Today we both have I definitely have a hard stop in a few minutes. So I want to spend the last 6 or 7 minutes on this idea of tariffs. So Canadians are really upset that President Donald Trump is threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian imports to the United States. And, again, yesterday when we were talking about this, Nate was trying to promote the biblical, a biblical understanding of nations paying, for what they use. And that seems to be an example of free trade. But within that same text is accountability. So can you try to help people understand where tariffs might be placed? You've already hinted at it, and the limits then to tariffs. But, how does it work?
I think, tariffs are taxation, right? And they're a form of taxation. I think tariffs can be powerful in at least 2 places, just quickly. Number one, if you have an unfair trading partner, and so you have a trading partner that might be subsidizing certain products so that they're cheaper and then flooding them into your country. And if they do that, then those goods that they're flooding in, you will not produce them in your own country. You'll lose the manufacturing or the production capabilities, and that other country will get a bit of a leg up on it. I think that's unfair because they might be subsidizing them, and they're allowing products that come into your country at lower prices than really what is the market. And so that's some of what, of course, Donald Trump is concerned about in the United States, is that China is dumping products and bringing them into the United States with very low tariffs. And yet, if the United States wants to sell into China, the tariffs are higher. So in that case, I think it's very fair to level a tariff to equal the playing field. You're equaling the playing field. You're saying, hey, wait a second, we're not going to give you an unfair advantage so you can dump products in our country. And then that strips away our manufacturing capabilities, and then we lose that manufacturing capability in our own country. In the case, yeah.
I just want to ask you a follow up to that, Jonathan, because you said something that really, really quickly. Are you saying so the Chinese government would subsidize a product being made? The product comes into another economy like the US at a cheaper rate. But then when the US sells a product into China, the Chinese government taxes that at a higher rate so that the Chinese government is making their money back. So they are building their economy by subsidizing products while undermining the American economy by them adding tariffs to products that are being subsidized. So like they're actually building their economy because they're producing something and then they're selling it and they're making their money back through tariffs. And is that what you were essentially explaining?
That's exactly what I'm saying. And so you have to peel back what's happening here. The other thing that the Chinese are doing, and this involves Canada now, is they're sneaking products into Canada and then selling them through Canada into the United States and taking advantage of our free trade agreement that we have with the United States. And that hasn't been lost on Donald Trump and the Americans either. They've been trying to do the same thing in Mexico, building cars in Mexico and then being able to take advantage of the free trade that Mexico also has with the United States. So when you're talking about these tariffs, I think, look, part of the good use of tariffs is to equal or level the playing field. If the playing field is not, if the other party isn't playing fair, then use the tariff so that you're ultimately going to level the playing field. The same thing is what Trump has his issue with Europe. Europe has a very high level of tariffs. I think it is around 25%. Don't quote me on this, but it's 25% or so on cars. If the Americans ship cars into Europe, and especially Germany, but if Germany wants to send their Mercedes-Benz and their fancy German cars into the United States, it was like 2.5%. So he's saying, hey, wait a second here. This isn't fair. So that's why he says reciprocal tariffs. And so I think tariffs are a very wise thing if you're going to level the playing field. The other thing I would say is I think tariffs can also be very important if you want to protect core industries. If you identify in your own country that there's an industry that you must support, it could be military, it could be feed into your military, it could be mining industry, which gives you critical minerals and resources and so forth, then I think it's fair enough to try to protect those industries for your own protection in terms of your own country. So I think that's another good use of tariffs. Also, I mean, Donald Trump's using them a bit as a club. And sort of as a blunt instrument. And I understand people don't like that. But then in terms of Canada, back to the Canada-US situation, he's also identified that we're not really policing our country very well, both internally. We've got a lot of Chinese influence. I'm sure you've talked about that. The drugs, the trafficking is extensive in this country, and the RCMP and our police officers do not touch it. They'll pull over speeders, they'll pull over you and I for, standing in front of an abortion clinic or something like that, but they're not bothering with the fentanyl. Trump's had enough of that. So he's saying, no, you've got to get control of your own country. And then our borders, I mean, we've got one of the largest, borders in the world, especially up in the Northwest Territories and up in the northern part of our country. That is not being patrolled. And the Chinese are up there and the Russians are up there. And so he looks at our military spend. And so when Trump talks about our trading deficit, he's including the fact that we're not spending enough on military. And basically we're living off of the US military. To me, that's a fair point. And it's not fair for us to sit there and say, we're these lovely people when we're allowing Chinese influence and money and drug money and trafficking in our country. And then we can't even defend their northern passage, and the Chinese and Russians are up there and Trump's concerned about it. So we've got to be honest with ourselves. So the tariff situation, unfortunately, I think gets muddied in there because Trump kind of, he likes to keep everybody on the go and on the defensive. And as I say, he's unpredictable. And I think he's thrown the tariff situation in there in the Canadian situation, with us in Canada, to really deal with those issues, not necessarily our trade issues. Our trade issues with the United States are very, very balanced. We're not really in that much of a hole. And in fact, because we ship so many raw materials, including oil and gas and potash and uranium and so forth, these are high value added products for the United States, which they can then take and then manufacture and create all sorts of wealth around. The US has a good deal with Canada, and our oil is actually sold at a discount to the world's price. So they're able, we're actually subsidizing the energy bill for the United States. So I think Trump's issue is not really with trade with us. It's the way the Chinese have influenced us and our lack of military spending. And also, I think, Justin Trudeau, he doesn't like, clearly he's got a big issue with the Liberals and the federal government in Ottawa. And the rest of it becomes, I think, unfortunately, noise. And, Canadians get a little prickly, but I think we have to look at ourselves honestly and say we have not been running our country very well, and certainly not as respectful neighbors of the United States. And we have to do a lot better.
Yeah, I really like that point, Stephen, because I think that that's the military point is a very big one. We Canadians, and here now as a Canadian living in the U.S., you really understand how important the military is here in the United States. And I know in Canada, there's a level of honor of the Canadian military, but there is certainly not the level of investment or understanding. And I think that we do get security, homeland security, for a much smaller price tag because of the big brother that is just south of the border. And so it has always made sense to me that this negotiating tactic is trying to call Canada to the table to say, look, like, pay your military bill, like get going, or option B is 51st state, everybody, come on down. Let's figure that out. And, okay. Last thing, question for you, Jonathan, this is more just for fun. What do you think Danielle Smith should do? I think that any premier in Canada that would say, if you're serious about taking us, let's have a talk. I think that the politicians in Canada are just destroying an opportunity to change Canadian culture and to wake up Canadians with all of this over the top response of national identity. I think they'd be much better to go, look, well, if we can't get the Liberals to figure things out, yeah, let's have open talks with the U.S. I think more Canadians would get on board with saying, well, wait, we may not want to join the U.S., but we love the fact that you as a politician are aligning with with all of these cultural and fiscal changes we're seeing.
Yes, I'm sympathetic to Danielle Smith, and I would suggest that if I were running Alberta right now, I'd be in very close talks to the United States about whether it would make sense to actually join with the United States. I mean, in the very least, I think in Canada, we should be having the discussion of a closer monetary union. It makes no sense not to have that discussion, particularly in a world that's becoming increasingly bipolar with the Chinese and our inability to defend our own country. And the power of the United States. And so why wouldn't we at least have a stronger monetary union that could lead to political issues? What's quite ironic, as you know, Michael, is we've had Justin Trudeau the last 9-10 years now almost say we're not a nation, we're a post-nation state and all of that. We're just basically part of the globe. Yeah. He's flooded our country with immigrants that know nothing about our history. They don't teach our history in our schools anymore. There is very little national pride. And then when something like this happens, all of a sudden we have this great national pride and we're a country and all of this. It's all nonsense. What we need to get back to is the basics. And also when you consider what his father did, Pierre Trudeau, when he brought in repatriated the Constitution, and he gave us basically a Constitution and rights package that isn't worth the paper it's written on. It all comes from the government. It doesn't come from God. Yeah. And so there's no value beyond what the government says in terms of our freedoms. So when you look at that whole package, I think as Christians, we need to be honest and say, hey, wait a second. Maybe we need to have conversations with the U.S. We need to shape up ourselves, obviously, but let's not be naive about this. We're really not running a country that can protect itself, can't even police itself. And we're being flooded, and we have very little identity left, which is, again, I'm sad to say all of that, but we have to also be realistic. And if I were Danielle Smith, who has basically subsidized the rest of the country, Alberta that is, for decades and decades, especially Quebec, with these equalization periods and payments and all of the money that flows from Alberta to support Quebec and the Atlantic provinces, you would be good and hot and angry and mad that you can't get pipelines across the country. You can't get your Alberta oil and energy to the East Coast, and the East Coast brings in 1 million barrels a day from Venezuela and from Saudi Arabia and from Nigeria and so forth. These things are ridiculous. And so I think we need to have an open mind, and we need to keep the conversation going, and we need to be realistic and honest and look in the mirror and have a healthy self-assessment of the situation that we're in here in Canada, rather than just pushing back and being naive about it. It's a dangerous world. It's not becoming less dangerous, and the United States is a great partner, and we need to work more closely with them.
Well, Stephen, it's been great having you on the show, everybody. This is just a small teaser follow-up from the conversation Nate and I had on economics. These are all things that we Christians need to be thinking about. And Jonathan, I appreciate your breadth of knowledge, your integration with that, with Scripture and the Lordship of Christ. And so, thank you so much, everybody. Make sure you check out Rocklinc Investment Partners. That's Rocklinc with a C.com. Jonathan, thanks so much for your time and jumping on here with me. Bye, everybody, and Godspeed.